This is your urgent call to action. We are all called to lead in a world in chaos, crisis, and turmoil. Join a pivotal global movement for change to transform the leadership crisis worldwide. Will you play it safe, or will you wake up, step up, and speak out? Like Nelson Mandela did for South Africa and the world, we need a radical new way to think, act, and lead, leading boldly into the future. Join host Ann Pratt, a Harvard Fellow and multi-awarded businesswoman, and unlock the best version of yourself to revolutionize leadership with what the world needs now.
Greetings to all you future bold leaders. Thank you for joining us from around the world. My name is Ann Pratt, formerly from South Africa, and relocated abroad to attend a Harvard Advanced Leadership Fellowship in beautiful Boston in the United States of America. Our bold leader today joins us from the southern tip of Africa, from the land of my birth, South Africa. He was raised by his pioneering grandmother, who served as a diplomat and was raised in exile on multiple continents. He is a global multi-awarded businessman, academic, author, diplomat, and has been profiled as one of the most sought-after strategists of the 21st century. Pretty intimidating, he has not just one, but 3 doctorate degrees. The first in strategic foresight, the second is in diplomacy and security intelligence, and the third is in the psychology of law. He has a double master's in actuarial science and economics. He has been called the rainmaker, the kingmaker, a Pan-Africanist at heart, a person who has served and counseled kings, prime ministers, presidents, and corporate boards globally. Stay with us as he shares what drove his hunger to succeed, how April the 11th redefined his urgent ideals, what kingdoms still have to offer us in terms of understanding and knowledge and wisdom, and the clarion call for leaders today. We warmly welcome His Excellency, Professor Dr. Tal Edgars, and welcome to Leading Boldly into the Future. Greetings, Professor Edgars. It's such a joy to meet you in person after our interaction. Thank you for being part of this global conversation.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me.
You know, looking at your background, I marvel at it. I've read thousands of resumes in my professional career and life. I can't even imagine how you have begun to achieve all these accomplishments in academia, in the world of business, in the world of giving back. As a starting point, what has been the critical factor that for you has created what you call this hunger to succeed?
Thank you for the question. And I think most people would liken it to persistence, motivation, and all the other things that would want to throw in as a casual role of, under the haystack. For me, mine was merely coming from motherhood. I watched my mother, I watched my grandmother struggle in what was then the South Africa, the identity of not being able to be at the leadership or at the forefront of so many things. But I was much more blessed to have a front row seat towards them being in leadership. And while we were in exile and rotating different countries, one of the things that was very common for me was to start to identify from a very young age that women had no place in leadership. And being horned by these women who I looked towards as both mother and father, they then inculcated in me the idea that when you get your chance, as you put on your crown, make sure that you create space.
Yes.
And it became as ordinary for me that whenever I got a chance to speak up about anything else, I would speak up about gender. Before I would speak up about security, before I would speak up about anything else, I would speak up about gender, because that was what was very, very reasonable to me coming from a home setting.
Yeah.
So I was driven by the pains and the anguish of what was then the fourth and, the third and the fourth administration of women in the liberation.
Yeah.
And now growing up in a more civilized world where in the middle of the United States, with the democracy as much as they have, and coming back home and seeing the reality that we must start to fix things.
Yeah.
And that is what drove me now to say, how do you fix things? How do we fix things in business? How do we fix things in leadership? How do we fix things in religion? And that's where it all started.
I was delighted to learn that we grew up in the same home province of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. Can you take us back to a particular moment in your young life, Professor, that was a very difficult, dark time, a specific event? What was that moment, and what was the revelation? How did you navigate through that early childhood experience?
Thank you, Anne. I think basically it was wrestling the moral advantage, right? Here we were in a country where there was so much disproportionate in terms of what can you do and who can you become.
Mm-hmm.
And whether or not you moved from, and back then, of course, you were known by where your ID was from. So,
yes.
So you were not allowed to cross over to certain parts. Freedom was not just the element. It wasn't something that we looked at and said, this is what we wanted. It was the idea that what becomes of that freedom when you do finally get it. And so we were taught quite early in advance that it is not just about paying attention to you being a leader. It was the people around you. And why I'm saying I was wrestling with the moral advantage is many have seen that the people who went to exile were different from the people who stayed back.
Was there a particular event that triggered that moral advantage? Was it moving into exile?
It wasn't really something that triggered it, because then my grandmother had just moved into the diplomacy space as well. And so while she was being appointed to move into countries like Mozambique and into Botswana, and from Botswana into, Tanzania, into Kenya, moving on into Norway, each of this moves as you would want to have them. They challenged the rules of the game. Why? Because each of these countries were testing whether or not we had it in us to continuously fight for the same thing that we insisted we needed, not only in South Africa, but right across the African belt. So in South Africa, at that point, we were talking about apartheid. Anybody who remembers the massacres that were happening in Botswana, when we talk of the Francistown massacre, where South Africans, many were killed. And I remember when my grandmother used to eulogize it and say, nobody ever paid attention to the graves that were there.
The graves that were there. Okay.
Yeah. And then you move on to countries like Tanzania, where we were opened, they opened their gates and said, look, come in, create a community. So there was actually a community of South Africans in Tanzania. And I remember quite well how that worked. And then moving into Kenya. Now, all around, the issue was looking at what we were able to do in so many countries and still remain with our identity. How are we going to bring back that leadership identity back to South Africa, right? And it saddens me that today, the people who I stood on, and when I say stood on, is because half of them are not here and others are here. When I look around, that leadership identity is lost. Okay. There's a sense in which you can feel that we have long lost the courage to look at things from that moral ground and call it as it is. But now we are massaging and romanticizing certain ideals of leadership based on what is happening in the US or what is happening in the UK. And so we've drawn quite a blurred line for even the youth today, because you can clearly tell that power taken is not power that can be worked with. They are not thinking about the impact on society anymore. We are thinking about how to just transform and drive a society. So in my own little way, I think what we learned along the way while we were in exile was our brotherhood. When we talk about Ubuntu, it was Ubuntu in the real meaning of it, not just from the word and we can call it once a time, it was really in the sense of it.
And I wanted to just check in, how old were you when you went into exile, and was it your mother and your grandmother, and what sort of roles did they play in these new countries that you were moving to?
I was about 6, 7, and it was only with my grandmother.
With your grandmother?
So only with my grandmother. And of course, that disadvantage was that you were clinging onto the traditions of the last point where you were at and not those of where you're going. So everything was learning anew, education, the idea around society, norms and practices. And it gave you a whole outlook of what globalization looked like. You were not really relegated to think about the township,
Yes.
as we would want to put it. I wasn't relegated to think about black or white. I was relegated to believe that society and the whole idea around universal suffrage, sovereignty of a people, comes not by the color or the race or the creed of the religion. It came through the brotherhood, and a brotherhood had no lines drawn.
In your mind, what are the biggest leadership challenges for Africa, perhaps South Africa, Africa, and the world today? What stands out? And is there a common thread?
What stands out for me is, and I believe I'll make this much more personal from my perspective, is I grow very wary of the broad issues that, as much as we might applaud how far we have come, there's a sense in which there's a gap between the announcement of these issues and the fulfillment of issues, right?
Yeah.
Everything in Africa now has become something much more likened to whether it needs an act of parliament. If we talk about gender-based violence, it's an act of parliament. If we talk about infrastructure, an act of parliament. And so Africa has continued to push the agenda of an advanced state of decay, unlike what is happening around the world. The other part of it would be, what is the difference between rhetoric and reality? And in Africa more so, there's a huge gap there. Because for me, in leadership today, we have many people who are more educated than they are formed. And I'd like to perhaps extrapolate that much more, is we have educated mindsets. And I call this the tallest academic dwarfs. We spend much more time churning graduates in Africa. And now we ask, what are we using that knowledge repository for? But what is a formed mind? A formed mind is where we have the ideas of what would leadership look like in terms of the psychological components. What's the leadership persona? How do we go around navigating this blocked mobility of leadership between the old and the new? Are we leaving government to be a functioning anarchy, or is it a non-negotiable? And so the knowledge that we are churning from universities today and from institutions of higher education, where does it all go? Are we more educated than we are informed? And my biggest question is, how then do we use this information? Because if you're to look at South Africa, and then let us look at Rwanda, okay? Perhaps just the two for now.
Yeah.
South Africa, Rwanda has been a country that by far, we could only tell from the massacres that happened. But today, the transition of that into a democratic state, into the state of transformation that it is undergoing, what do we learn from this? We are quick not to learn from our own and fast enough to adapt from others. And that is where now I'm more worried as to whether it is a deficient system of learning that we might have to worry about. Because if you look at the statistics today, how many people are moving from South Africa to the United States, believing the United States to be much better, idea of where to live, where to raise their children. But the democracy that we are so yearned for in South Africa, is it worth fighting for, by then saying these are the non-negotiables rather than leaving the state to anarchy?
Yeah. So within that, what is your definition of leadership?
My definition of leadership is simple. Mine is to look at how do we transform society and those things around us, not only by what we do, because for me, I believe solidly that what we have done through us, leadership for me is what we can do through us and not by us. If we can let go of the fact that my name is printed on this thing, my name is to be put out on this thing, we will be able to lead without wanting this to be a self-importance kind of exercise. But unfortunately, let us be honest, this is what Africa looks like. It is all about self-importance. I did this, not about how I transformed this. So that in itself would be the transition for me, that if you are to do anything, can it be done through us and not by us? If we talk about transforming economies, transforming society, it would need a whole group of people and an appreciation of a wider audience than yourself. And that for me is the true definition of leadership, where your self-importance is let go of, and it creates an audience where it invites others, so that you have this universal library of minds that can then say, we did it. And that is the true Ubuntu, because Ubuntu is a we function, not an I function.
Absolutely, absolutely. So coming back to the challenges that we have, given that this definition of leadership of, what can be done through us, not by us, what are the biggest threats facing the world today?
Very interesting question, Anne. I think many people would liken it to sporadic terrorism, moderate constitutionalism. I would want to paradoxically name it to men and women who have understood the law, and invite, even seek its sanction by deliberately violating it in the name of a higher truth. That is our biggest concern today, that those who take the positions of power have violated that same existence of the law because they understand it and they know it. Let us be honest, none of the leaders who we can periodically bring to table and say they were wrong did not know they were wrong. They did, but they violated that truth. Because why? They understood it. They sanctioned the deliberately violating it because they know how to go about it. And unfortunately, that is true, that as of today, the issues that will most likely damage the countries that we work for will not be terrorism or constitutionalism or capitalism. It will be people who have completely lost the value of the law.
Interesting. Kind of moving to something very personal for you, Professor. April the 11th, you went through a very traumatic carjacking. I know, I think at the time, and in fact, you shared a message with me, talking about how really it had deepened your spiritual work and shaped you, and how adversity has shaped you to be more and to fight, to become well again and to overcome. Can you take us back to that day? What happened, and what did you go through emotionally, personally, mentally, psychologically?
Thank you so much, Anne. That is a question that I have had to ask myself over and over again. I think I am not one of the few that has gone through it. I think it is something that has become merely an occurrence of habit. And if I were to look at it from a very objective point, now this happened to me in what you would call the safest suburbs. This did not happen to me in the rural areas, did not happen to me in a township area, did not happen to me in what we would identify in the US as the areas of the Bronx or things of that nature. This happened to me in a suburb area. And this is in Sandton. So Sandton,
South
which
Africa.
if you were to look closely at it, we term it as one of the Africa's richest square mile. Okay. Now, here you are with your family, and you are driving out from church. This is not coming from anywhere else. You're driving out from church, and a car comes through and you're accosted out of a car and they pull out guns. And fortunately for me, it wasn't the first time. So it didn't look like a surprise to have seen them. But I look at the negative impact that had on the people in the car, and I look at what I, as a leader, felt for that split moment.
And who was in the car with you, Professor?
So I had my family. I had my partner in a car with me, and unfortunately for me, it wasn't a thing where you look back and wonder. I literally had to ask myself, am I going to let this define the feeling of where I am and what I need to do, and what then becomes of the reality of tomorrow? So here you are, you've been carjacked, guns have come out, the security around both blocks of the buildings disappeared, right? You don't have a firearm on you, you don't have bulletproof vest on you, you have to run to safety. But the bigger problem was the police did not arrive in time.
Yeah.
They arrived at, you can imagine it happened at around 6 p.m., 7 p.m. in the evening. They arrived at midnight. That gave me, again, another couple of hours. If anybody else was about to try something, it would have happened. The shock for me was seeing the reality of what other people go through right in front of my eyes. How does this happen to everybody, and how do they come out of it? Because I spent months figuring out, why did this happen? It was 6 p.m. It wasn't 9 p.m., 10 p.m. Why did this happen? Why did it happen to me? And far away from the feeling of being a victim is, how do you then borrow that into leadership? What became my urgent ideals starting the next day? And the first thing that came to mind was, how many people go through this? Why is it that we are doing nothing about it? Yes, we can say that crime is rampant, but what is driving the crime? And what kind of leadership do we require to stamp out the crime, but also to address the issues of the victims? Because the victims are ignored. The self-help and the therapy and the post-traumatic disorders and the readjustment disorders are things that we ignore. And so going back to work, people believe that you should go back to work after 2 or 3 days.
Yeah.
They do not understand that this is an event that now shapes the identity of, I don't want to be here. And of course, I went through that whole phase. I don't want to be here. I want to go back to the United States. I feel I'm safer in the United States. And so I started to question all these things. But firmly enough, my identity was not shaped from this, because the power of having been through similar situations, I saw this as a moment in time that allowed me to speak and say, we must craft a different identity for these people. There must be a reason that people are willing to take up arms and rob people rather than to spend it sufficiently in looking for jobs or creating jobs. Why? Because they're out of work. And ideally, when they spoke to me, and when they were holding the guns, they were saying in Zulu, and they were saying, you know what, this one seemed like they have money. So it is a money issue. It's not a personality issue. It's not that they chose me because I'm different. It's not because they would choose you because you're different. It was a money issue. And so what are we talking about? The scales of economy have kind of tipped. They wanted to have a chance to have what others have. Can we address this? Can we address this through the various medium-term strategies we talk about, through the APPs that we channel out as departments? And that is where now the dream began to get involved more in terms of the social development of South Africa.
You authored a book, Good Karma in Business.
Yeah.
What struck me about that, and what struck me about what you said, is that do we respond only to financial issues when it hurts our pockets and our bank accounts and putting food on the table? Could you share with us the sort of basic message in your book, Good Karma in Business, and what is the business case, Professor?
Quite simply, is to argue the idea that is CSI, as we perhaps know it, is it
corporate social investment? Yeah,
indeed. But that is the terminology you and I would use, because we sit in boards, we are executives. But let us use the term that is heard by the people we would refer to as the collective. It's confused social investment, right? The mere fact that once in a while a corporation would go down to a place and donate things and take pictures for it. When have you known good to have a picture on it? It hasn't been the case. And we are learning a whole new form of actions in society. And so the social impact today, and what the book tries to question, was what would then be seen as profit for purpose? Or if not, what would then be seen as progress for purpose? Now, the two identify quite differently in society today, because people are now starting to push the idea that this partnership for progress. But where is that progress? Is that progress in terms of EBITDA and turnover? We are more justified by what we seek to do. And so organizations are cleverly starting to identify how to tie themselves to the UN, Sustainable Development Goals.
Yeah.
Here is where I am about to be much more of the devil's advocate. What is sustainable? Because goals in themselves would not be. Actions are. So is it sustainable goals, sustainable actions? And if you are to look at it differently, then we would say, what are we set to achieve? In the medium term and in the interim of society today, much as we have the global compact program, and we have so many of these programs, and I would not want to ignore the significance of them. But I need to ask, and I beg to ask, how do they change the narrative for that one person in Empangeni, and not the corporation that has a corner boardroom of executives with the highest paid dividend? If we can answer that, quite honestly, we will be pushing society to a place to say we have a much better society that we have now that was left in our hands than the ones that we see. We are good at strategizing ahead of us. We ignore what is happening today. So COVID tested what is happening today, but people have had strategic plans for 5 years. There was no risk planning saying, what if today there was an event such as this?
Yeah.
And for you to see the questions, right, for you to see the questions that were asked is, there was a disruption of the supply chain, there was a disruption of common living, there was a disruption of the idea around relationship building.
I mean, strategy is meant to lead us to good plans and action. It's a question around where is the gap? If there are sustainable development goals that lead us in a direction that says we want to make a sustainable difference with a good strategy and a good plan, it raises the question, where is the gap in this?
But then begs the question, and you raise a very, very important point in that. When we talk about sustainability today, what kind of leadership do we require for us to achieve that sustainability? We ignore what that question lies there for. So the metaphor has constantly been that it doesn't matter what strategy we put on the table, it will be achieved. There's a certain set criteria of leadership required to be able to create the sustainability we're talking about. If it costs us 100,000 Rand per job, and we are talking about a 1.3 billion investment in South Africa today, what kind of leadership do we require to produce 1.3 million jobs with an 100,000 per person kind of, index line item to work with? We have ignored that. So we are just saying whoever has a strategy, it's going to be delivered. Can we not have a merit system that checks and challenges the leadership that we want to see today? And if we can have that, then we would have a formed mind and not an educated mind.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And Professor, it leads me into the next question. You alluded to the global icon and symbol of freedom, Nelson Mandela, Madiba, as we so fondly call him.
Right.
In your mind, how relevant is Mandela's example, his leadership in the world today, when you talk about that kind of leadership for sustainability?
I think the first would be that the only possible idea of Africa is that of a nation greater than the sum of its parts. To him, and I pose that to all leaders, was it did not matter the vastness of the continent. What we fought for in one South Africa was fought for across the divide. We ignore what has shaped our mind, what has anchored our identity, what has influenced our beliefs and made us who we are. But if we were to be quite honest with ourselves, if we were to go back and to look objectively at what animated us into self-independence, then we would reconstruct what the new construct of leadership looks like. Because we have lost it somewhere along the way. We have decided that everything else would not matter, and everything has become recycled, even dreams. I have a dream, Martin Luther King, has been recycled by many into different versions of it.
Yeah.
But are we acting on it? Are we just speaking of it? If we could go back to what animated us, I believe we would be able to answer such questions as to what was the Madiba thought? What was the idea around multiple identities in South Africa, where they are all minorities? The heterogeneity is definitional. It is a definitional part of research, and there's going to be a strong library of that.
Yeah.
But how do we bring all this together? How do we enforce a uniform rule that sees opportunities open to both men and women, that sees opportunities open to colors and race and gender without entirely having to define it within the roles of society every day? If we were to borrow his thinking today and look at what we have created, best believe that we would be ashamed. We would be ashamed because we lost it along the way. We
lost it along the way.
And
when you say we, who are you alluding to in the we?
I'm alluding to all of us. We play a part in it. I am taking my stock of reality, preferably with a clenched fist and eyes at the back of my head. But either way, I am one of the leaders, and I cannot question what the others will do if I am not part of it. So to sum it and look at it is, how do I play a part? What has my role been in it? And how am I reintroducing and harnessing the thought of Madiba today? Because again, if we were to go back into the sense of what we call mirror neurons in the world of neuroscience, leadership is imitated as much as it can be worked on. If I can do best, can I translate that to 4 or 5 other leaders? What you're doing today has come through a collective library of leaders who you've been able to speak to. Sure. Individually, each of these leaders have shaped your mind, and they have been able to have a strong belief pattern on you. If we could be able to harness that through a strong list of 200 leaders across the continent, would we achieve a different set of leaders? I believe so.
You believe so?
I believe so.
You know, I know you were born in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. You then at age 6 or 7 moved to various parts of Africa and then abroad to Norway, came to the USA. You know, you really are a global citizen in so many ways. And of course, as we know, Madiba was truly a global citizen too.
Yes. Yes.
When you think back, so many moments we have witnessed his life, his leadership. Is there a particular date, event, moment in time for you, Professor, that really stands out, a Mandela moment that truly impacted you and the way you think, act, and lead today?
I believe there's one very simple moment for me, and many might not have paid attention to it. And perhaps I might not get the intricacies of it completely correct, but still, I believe it was his first visit, and it was a debate he was having with one of the famous radio hosts and presenters in the United States of America. I think it was Ted Copeland, if I'm not wrong.
That's right, in New York City.
Exactly. And the questions that were posed to Madiba at that particular point in time were questions that I would like to refer to leaders today. And one of them was, why would he support Cuba when he very well knows that Cuba is an enemy to the United States? And in his answer, he inferred that why would the enemy of the United States be an enemy of South Africa? As of currently today, he was saying, we are comrades. And if they're willing to support us for what we are doing back at home, for the kind of similar issues that we are facing, then they are our comrades. Let us then look at that in terms of Africa today. The same boundaries that were created during times of colonialism are the same boundaries that have cut us off from each other.
Yeah.
We are very quick to adopt and romanticize the idea of likening ourselves to the West or to the East or to Europe, if you can. What happened to Africa? If you were to take a general idea around today, our knowledge production in Africa, perhaps, if anything, is only merely happening within silos. Yet each of us has got similar social issues. When we talk about load shedding in South Africa, it is no different from what is happening in Nigeria.
Yeah.
Power production is an issue. If we talk about having arable land that is uncultivated and we are buying more in imports in a year. It is no different than what is happening in Sierra Leone. If we are talking about gender-based violence, we are talking about contemporary feminism in Botswana and in South Sudan. Why should we not then say that the first dream of Pan-Africanism in the 56 and 60s to 63, when the Organization of African Unity had Mwalimu Julius Nyerere bring the first idea of a united Africa? Why has that concept gone to? We have lost it. We have been much easier to bring up the idea that we are friends to the West and friends to the East. And by no means am I saying it is wrong, Anne. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
I am simply saying that as much as we would like to look at them and admire them, we must also look towards our brothers and sisters and say, what is it we can do together that would change and shape the narrative of where we are going?
It's such an important point, Professor, because what strikes me about that is deglobalization, if you like, this kind of back to populism and really focusing on national sovereign states rather than this bigger picture thinking of what really unites us across boundaries. And you know, if we think back to the global collective movement, anti-apartheid movement, we had to transcend our national borders to engage the world with a common purpose to eradicate a dysfunctional, oppressive, brutal system of apartheid. And if I'm hearing you correctly, what you're saying is that we really need to rethink what created our success in overcoming apartheid in South Africa. It was looking beyond our borders. It was finding those common threads and common purpose with our fellow brothers and sisters to fight a collective fight, if you like, for freedom.
We have never before been tested on the ideals of togetherness as we were during COVID. And that ideal stood strong when all borders were shut down and we could no longer ask for help. We have likened ourselves to the idea that help is, we ask for help even when it's not needed. And COVID tested that because now industry started to shut down while others started to give birth to newer generations of thinking. And that in itself is a novelty of what sometimes times of distress can bring about. If we could be able to evoke that feeling that we can look towards ourselves with a solution to drive our own solution, because nobody else would interpret our problems to the best of our knowledge. We do, but we have ignored that. And now we give more presence. And if anything, we give fast hand or fast right to, you know, people who are coming from different worlds. And by no way am I saying it is wrong, but I am saying that as much as we can inculcate that knowledge, let us produce our own knowledge. Let us write stories of our women leadership. Let us write stories of our youth leadership. Let us write stories of our elderly and the leadership that they were able to bring to fore. And what can we learn in order for us to embrace? Because if they survived a tougher time than we did, clearly there's a lesson in it.
Of course, of course. And if I understand you correctly, you're also saying about connecting across the borders of countries within Africa to actually form that collective around defining these solutions to many common problems.
We could, because if you look at everything that has happened, we have very good knowledge production happening in Africa. Professor Nkomo, Professor Ali Mazrui, we've got Professor Callistus Juma, we have got professors in South Africa and right across, even within the federal states, when you talk about common currency and foreign currency, like Sunusi, who was a former governor. If we could bring all of that into the idea that we have knowledge production being pushed from our African issues, we could learn a thing or two about novelty ideas. We could learn a thing or two about advancing our knowledge economies. We could learn a thing or two about arresting the idea around anarchy. But we refuse and we ignore that comes from another place and we label it as foreign. And we say, you know, that is a Botswana concept, that is a Kenyan concept, really. It is a concept of African identity rather than a concept of national identity.
Shifting gear a little, a couple of fun facts about you. What was, moving countries like you did at a young age required a whole lot of adaptation and change. What was one of your highlights in moving and living in these different countries?
I believe the greatest highlight was learning new languages. The idea of having to experience a whole new culture, a whole new sense of appreciation for language and music, far as it might be. If anybody in exile were to tell you that the things that held us together was music, I don't know why and how, but I believe that we picked and identified to music and culture very frequently, to the point that if you visited all the people who were in exile, you'd find a taste of Africa in their homes, right? And that was one of the most richest parts of being in exile, in identifying and feeling that really the culture that we have, and if you were to go down now to the languages themselves, it was not far off from what we speak. The difference might have been the dialect in itself and the pronunciation of it. But when you look at it in relative terms, it was simply the same. We were all Bantu speaking countries. And that was fascinating. Till today, when we talk about
which languages did you learn? Which song or music stood out for you?
So when we started learning things like Portuguese, and as you crossed over to then what was Southern Rhodesia or Northern Rhodesia, you'd learn the Shona, or you'd look at the Shona and the Ndebele cultures. When you got into Tanzania, when you'd see the Swahili culture, and quite around Africa, much more of it was during that time. So many tribes were different. So you'd see people who are coming from West Africa who are in Botswana then, and they teach you a bit of Pidgin, or you'd hear Creole, which was coming from Sierra Leone. And as confusing as it might have been, it gave you a little sense of identity, because you started learning small terminology that could help, and today, one of the greatest wars of language, I believe, if we were to look at it, was when Kiswahili was made an official language of the African Union. It was a long time coming, because those who were in exile at one point in time must have engaged on that kind of language before. So it was very fascinating to learn that if in South Africa we say inyama, in Swahili they say nyama, so it's not much different.
Nyama meat.
From the yes. So you can see there was not much difference. To every living condition. What we saw as our dress code, theirs would be a different dress code, just with more colors or more vibrance. So it was really a time to connect with the multipolarity of just that fabric of African identity. And I think it created also a sense of Pan-Africanism for many of us, not Black nationalism, Pan-Africanism.
Pan-African. And your favorite music? Just do you have a particular song or music or?
So we still had a lot of Miriam Makeba playing through Africa. Pata. Exactly, Pata Pata. And we would have a lot of Oliver Mtukudzi playing right across Africa. We had a lot of Hugh Masekela playing right across Africa, especially when, that was the music that united us. Anybody who remembers jazz during apartheid would tell you that the Pimville Railway, where people used to jump on a train at 4 a.m., everybody used to kind of sing along to a jig. So I think the music was what united us, to feel a sense of, it was our escape, to bring the experiences of, because the musicians had traveled wide, so their experiences were in their songs, and we felt we could identify with the richness of that song.
That's so interesting. And, you've been called the Kingmaker. You serve, you've been part of advisory councils, personal councils of kings across the continent.
Yes.
What attracted you to working with kingdoms? And what do you think is the gift of those kingdoms still today with these different kind of institutional structures?
I believe that with kingdoms, one of the things that was there was, what is the difference of the liberties and the limits of democracy versus their traditional context of democracy? And what they've been able to maintain is the rich culture, which by far we have ignored today. And working with kingdoms, one of the things that was very evident was leadership was not based on how do I see you. It was based on communities giving up a person who they believed would be the best option for leadership. And how did it work? So, and I think basically, if we were to question, that is why the federal system of government existed in areas like Nigeria and of course newly introduced into Kenya, but the chief's roles were still there. Now, in being inside that kingdom, one of the things you also are able to see is, where did these biases come from? Predominantly the patriarchal systems. When we start to look at, when we're talking about gender and diversity and inclusion of it, this is where it all began. We had traditional forms of government that ignored the advancement of feminism. And the richness of that culture ignored that this would be the state in another millennium. So they would only look towards history in terms of a century, what the king did, what the former king did. But not all through this have women been ignored, have the voices of children or youth been muted. And that drove me to understand now, as I sit to chair on what social development is and social entrepreneurship is, how can we change that narrative by inviting these collective corridors of power to a conversation and saying times have changed, but we must fix this injustice.
Which kings are you working with currently, Professor? And what do you think, even if you select one of them, what do you think their core message would be to the leaders of Africa today?
I'm currently working with His Royal Majesty King Osei Tutu II of Ghana, of the Ashanti Kingdom, one of the oldest kingdoms and one of the most powerful kingship leaders in the world. I believe his message is simple. He's a very new generation kind of king. And one of the things he's been able to do is formalize the idea that education is a must. Why education? I believe that Nelson Mandela said that education will make a better society for us. But I believe that also what the king is trying to say is that we cannot rewrite the wrongs of today if we are not educated to where we went wrong. Most of the reactive conversations we are having today, if you were to sit in a room, half of them are from a point of emotion, not from a point of education, not from a point of information, not from a point of knowledge. It is, we don't want. We don't want to see this. We do not like to see women in leadership. We do not want to see youth take over a country. We do not want to see foreigners in a country. It is a very personal message, but let us take a step back and understand what education has shown us and taught us. The misgivings of society between leaders and misleaders. And misleaders, I mean that there's a leadership cadre that has sat on leadership but cannot inform society of where they are going. If we were to change that, we would also have a knowledge-based economy. And I think education is the first step. It has been ignored, and we need to go back to that and say, what is it that is not in our current system that we would need to inculcate for the future of tomorrow? We cannot survive on just bringing up two tenets of what education in the future is. As much as we would like to talk about the Industrial Revolution, the fourth Industrial Revolution, and by no means am I saying it is a waste of time, but are we talking about issues to do with institutional prosperity, bequeathing wealth between the old and the new? If we cannot be able to define that, that is why a lot of tactics have been, we want to take things by force. Not by conversing, by force. A lot of things are more litigative than they are mediative. Can we mediate this conversation? If in the olden tribes and in the English of the old, many would liken that everything was based on mediation. We would speak in traditional circumstances. But today we speak by use of law. Our courts of law have got more cases to do with breakdown in education, not in information.
Interesting. And One last sort of question. What is something that people don't really know about you?
Wow, that would be very surprising. But most people do not know that as much as I love music, I equally love the idea of teaching. Teaching by far is my greatest soft spot than lecturing, and people have not really known the difference. To see a mind form under the gift of your hands is nothing more than a gift in itself. And to be able to transmute that over a generation, for me, feels like a purpose. And I often say it would be a shame to die without having made a major contribution to humankind. And mine, by all means, would be teaching. If I can teach conclusively a whole set of new leaders, then my work will have proven itself.
Well, Professor, I think you're in the right place and part of the right set of institutions and skills. And I think being part of this global Mandela leadership movement for change in the world is a great gift to have you as part of it. And I have no doubt that part of your purpose and your passion to educate the next generation. Any final message, leadership message that you have to remind our generation, but also to educate and empower the next, not only from your own perspective, but any final thoughts that you think Nelson Mandela would share with the world today?
I believe it is time that the clarion call is for leaders of a new set of rules and beliefs to wake up. Leaders who are not defined by the injustices we have so far gone through or by the predominant biases that we've had in society, but leaders who are set to create a transformative society. It is time for us to ignore the very small issues that we look upon ourselves and say that they hold water. Whether be it you are defined in corporate or you're defined in a 501(c) or you're defined in an NPO, we all have a seat at the table. And if we can come together and discuss amongst ourselves of how we can transform society and really set out to transform society, not for our own good, not for our own children, but with a real understanding of Ubuntu, then Africa is in good hands. We are not as backward or we are not as far off as people would want to imagine. We're just in an advanced state of decay, and we can rectify that. If we can come together, I believe opinions matter. I believe words matter. And as we would love to celebrate so many leaders just when we hear their Nobel Peace Prize laureates, let us celebrate leadership for the most common good that it has done. Let us look towards the people in society that are doing a big change. Let us look at the ones who are trying to do something. And let us embody the real spirit of Ubuntu and say it starts with us.
Professor, thank you for your remarkable mind, your inspiring words, and your caring heart. And I so look forward to us picking up this conversation again. Thank you for being part of this today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the message that you're sending right across. I believe that you are a very important and an integral part of what the future of the world looks like. And I believe that many should support that cause. So thank you for having me.
In partnership, Ubuntu, Ingamuntu, Ingabantu, Ingiyabonga.
You are because I am. Thank you.
Our thoughtful bold leadership takeaway with Prof. Edgars today is revealed in a life-threatening moment. April the 11th, 6 p.m., carjackers held up Prof. Edgars and his family at gunpoint and targeted his luxury car. It was a Sunday evening after church in one of Africa's richest square miles. The carjackers' words stayed with him. They said, "These ones have money." It is about the money, the deep divides between those who have a lot of it and those who have little or none. So what happens when we are faced with a traumatic or even life-threatening event? Do we react and come up with somebody to blame, a valid excuse, or a general complaint? Or do we respond? Do we pause, dig deep, and find the transformational leadership moment. Prof. Edgars did not react. He didn't respond with a valid and frequent complaint about crime in South Africa. Instead, he spent months thinking about that life-threatening moment and what it meant about leadership, his leadership, the government's leadership, South Africa's leadership. He asked himself big questions. Why did this happen? Why me? How many go through this? And what drives this crime? It was a point of change, a catalytic change. He shifted his view from this being about crime and security to thinking about social justice and social development as an important foundation for peace. He understood this was more than government's role. He asked himself, what is my part of the mess? And he thought deeply about what leadership is required to create significant systemic change. So what happened? How do we get from a carjacking and crime to finding a moment of transformational leadership, an opportunity for change? Well, like Prof. Edgars, we have a choice. Do we react or do we respond? When we react, we perpetuate more of the same. But when we respond, we dig deep, we ask thoughtful questions, and we find that transformational leadership opportunity for change. So you too can make a choice. You can react or you can respond. And until next time, remember that leading boldly is about making thoughtful, clear choices. And bold leadership is about taking bold action, just one step at a time. One step for you, but together, a giant step for humanity. So take care and take thoughtful, bold action.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Leading Boldly into the Future. Please find links and connections mentioned in this show in our blog and never miss an episode by subscribing at anne-pratt.com. That's ANNE-PRATT.com. May these insights from inspiring industry leaders, remarkable disruptors, and courageous champions of change bring forth a brand new you, emboldened, empowered, and ready to inspire hope. Come back soon, share with your friends, sign up on anne-pratt.com and join our movement for change. Why? Because the world needs you to lead boldly too.